All right. Good morning, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us today. We have a couple of housekeeping things before we start the presentation. We ask that you keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation, and if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom, and our speaker will be happy to address them throughout the lecture and at the end as well. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Oh, sorry. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end as well. And please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live, and it will be posted to our social media once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or any previous talks, please check out our Facebook page. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Florence Gillman, who's a docent with the Timken, and she's going to give a wonderful lecture today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Florence.
Oh, thank you, Tiffany. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining in. And I think that this topic, to me, which is fascinating, may also be interesting to you too. And I'll be interested in your comments and questions when I stop and ask you to make some short remarks or ask a brief question. So the title, Artist Fascination with an Egyptian Hermit, is actually the second in a series that I'm creating on hermits, which is an unusual topic, Egyptian hermits, except that it's inspired by it's inspired by a painting in the Timken collection, which I'm trying to move to now. Whoops, have a little technical problem here. There. So the Timken has this wonderful, very interesting painting called The Torment of St. Anthony, which, as you can see, was done in the early 16th century. So this is St. Anthony running away from the dark side of what is portrayed in the picture, which is very menacing, scary, frightful, and he's running toward the beautiful light side of the picture and toward a building in the background, probably. In the center, the division between the two sides of the picture, dark and light, is a rock formation, which I believe at the top here and at the bottom, the artist intended to be cave-like. So these details will figure into the story of Anthony, which I'm going to tell you. First, let me tell you a little bit about the artist, Savoldo. So he was active in the early 16th century, which puts him within the Renaissance in Venice. We don't know a lot about him, but we do know that the artist Titian was a very dominant figure in Venetian painting, and that affected Savoldo in the sense that he was probably less successful than he might have been had Titian not been dominating the scene. So I have noticed in the museum, and others have told me the same, that this painting tends to stop people as they go past it. You know, everybody doesn't look at every painting, but sometimes when they walk into a gallery, you notice that something immediately grabs their eye, and they tend to pause before they look at the rest of the things in the gallery. So I noticed that this painting, maybe because it's so starkly dark and white and so mysterious, really stops people. They really take time to look at this. And then I've noticed when I'm standing around, oftentimes people say, "What's that really about?" So it's about a 4th century hermit and named Anthony, who later is considered to be the founder of Christian monasticism. And this figure inspired many paintings. And as I move along here, I'll tell you why. So look at it one more time as we add some more information here. I tried to zero in on the dark side of it. So you see that it's a very unattractive, very scary place of not only dark, but fire, but mysterious kind of creatures. It looks like people are running toward this boat. I think they're running toward it, not running away from it. In other words, also trying to escape. Going back though, there's a big question, and I put it in the description of this lecture, which you may remember, and that is, Anthony is obviously running away from the dark. He's running away from evil. Some art historians think that this building over here to which he is running toward, maybe the monastery that in the 16th century commissioned this painting. In other words, he's running toward a life dedicated to goodness, running away from evil. But the big but is he is looking back. He's looking back. We could interpret that a number of ways. Is he afraid he's being chased? Or is he wondering if he made the right decision? Was his immersion apparently on the edge of evil? Was it so enticing that while he decided to run away from it, he nevertheless is reconsidering? We just don't know. But it makes the painting all the more intriguing to think about these things. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about his life, because he's a real person. He has a real story that we know elements of. So as you can see, he's a person of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, an Egyptian by birth. And as he grew up in a rather well-off family, he experienced the tragedy of his parents dying young. And he was left with their money. And he was also left with his younger sister. So he became the caretaker or guardian of his sister until she grew up. But at the meanwhile, as a young Christian man, he was very serious about how to be a real Christian. And he heard the reading from Matthew's gospel where Jesus tells the rich young man to go sell everything you have and come follow me. So Anthony wanted to do that. Now, if I had time, and I did this in the first lecture, which you could go back and find on Facebook, there was a climate, you could say, in the 4th century in Christianity, where the emperor had made Christianity legal, because the emperor Constantine himself became Christian. That changed things a lot, because then it became, you could say, stylish to become Christian. Not necessarily because you believed the Christian message, but because the emperor and other high-ranking officials had become Christian. And that was very hard for real Christians, because they were committed in terms of belief, not in terms of social ranking and so on. So it wasn't unusual for people like Anthony to make a radical step. He's just one of the most famous. So he sets his sister up with another family, leaves the money he had inherited with them, and he moves out into the desert. First, he just went out in the area near his town. Then he kind of moves a little further out into a cemetery area where he could hide among the graves for safety. But finally, he moves to an area of mountain caves near the Red Sea. I'll show you this on a map in a minute. He spends 20 years there living in this cave, which people still visit. And that isn't easy to do at all. It's not easy to be a hermit. First of all, you have to find a way to get some food. You have to find a way to get some kind of clothing. If you get sick, you need care perhaps, and so on and so on. So hermits actually have a very difficult time of survival. And if you're a hermit in the desert, your supplies of food are very limited. So he manages to live 20 years in a cave in which he has all kinds of interesting experiences, mystical kind of experiences, but also terrifying dreams of evil, trying to entice him to leave, to go back to a city, and to go back on his decision to do what Jesus had said, give up everything and follow Jesus. So he has a lot of strange experiences in those 20 years. But also a lot of people come and consult him, other people who want to live a similar life. But some of them want to live more together where they can help each other and where they can grow some food together and things like that. So he becomes like a spiritual guide. And by his mid-50s, he's called an Abba. And he would therefore leave his cave occasionally and go down to the lower land below it and talk to those people, those hermit type people, we call them monks, who wanted to live at least partially as a group. So he became, you could say, the founder of actually that type of monasticism, where people live in a group, but are also very hermetic much of their time. He died at a very old age. Sorry, I got some throat problems here. According to the sources, he was about 105, which is extraordinary. On the other hand, the sources of information about a person like him, like a saint, tend to be exaggerated in many ways, tend to heighten some facts, so can't be really sure. But anyway, the tradition is that he died at about 105, and he was buried secretly. That was probably, the idea of that was probably to prevent him, people coming and trying to dig up his remains and so on. Okay, I want to show you his world right here, which is the world of ancient Egypt in 4th, 5th century. So Anthony was from Lower Egypt being the area near the Mediterranean. And he's from this area right here of Alexandria. I hope you can see my pointer. And he's from a little town to the west of Alexandria. So when he first went into the desert after he left his sister, he went further west over in here. And there are still some monastic foundations there based on the time he spent there. But eventually he decided to go very far south, and he went down here to the area. This is Upper Egypt because it's higher land than Lower Egypt. So he goes to Upper Egypt, to the region that was then called the Thebais, to the area over here along the Red Sea. As you can see, it's very mountainous and has caves in it. Now, remember, he's not the only one who's doing this, but he's the most famous. So he goes here and he lives this cave life and has all these extraordinary experiences. So he's not too far from this city right here, Thebes on this map. And I will tell you quite a bit more about this as we go along, because it's important in the art about him. Okay, so after Anthony died and had established a group of hermits living as a community, this area developed into a monastery. And that monastery built upon itself over the years, so that while it began with very few buildings, it has and there was a place where they ate together called a refectory. It has grown and grown, and it is still there. So this monastery resulted in the monks being less solitary than Anthony was, more communal, and that is the lifestyle that the people who are monks there today live. Now, where do we get all this information? Well, the sources for Anthony's story are particularly the writer Athanasius in Anthony's own time period. Athanasius actually knew Anthony, so we have his story of Anthony. There is also a 13th century book. It's a compilation of the stories of all kinds of interesting figures, lots of them saints. That book, of which I believe European libraries have about 1,000 copies. That's extraordinary, but that reflects how popular this book was. So it was like you could have a story a day of a saint or some other interesting, intriguing figure. It's called The Golden Legend. I'll show you a copy of it in a minute. So you can see this in various libraries. Now, Anthony's story that's in there was written by the man on the left, Athanasius. So as I say, Athanasius was a contemporary of Anthony, but he was a bishop in Alexandria. He was not a hermit in any way. He was a leader, administrator of a diocese and so on, but he was very fond of Anthony, had known him for a long time, and wrote his story. When somebody writes a story of a saint, especially in the tradition of many ancient writers, they tend to highlight the extraordinary experiences of the person and the vision and the challenges of evil toward the person. So we don't actually call these stories history in our sense. What we call them is hagiography. So hagiography is like, you know that the author probably has heightened certain details to make it a good story. So therefore, it's a little hard to sort out history from hagiography. But anyway, he tells vivid stories about Anthony's encounters with the devil. And this is what we're going to see in numerous pieces of the art. And he also says, even though he wrote a rather long article about Anthony, we would call it an article. I think it's not a whole book. He says, oh, these are only a few of the details, only a few of the tales I could tell you. Now, Athanasius' writing inspired many, many people. Many people read what he wrote already in the 4th century, and later was included in the Golden Legend I told you about. So this man becomes very, very famous and inspired others. For example, the famous Saint Augustine. So here it is. Here's a copy of the Golden Legend. This one dates from the end of the 13th century. This one's in the Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy. The Laurentian Library you may very well have visited, because I know a lot of people who tune into these art history lectures are travelers, and you've probably seen the Laurentian Library. it was originally founded and funded by the Medicis. So this is has extraordinary books. Well, anyway, this is what the Golden Legend looks like. And so now, if you wanted to read about Anthony, you can read it. Fordham has what's called an internet medieval source book. You can actually read these sources. So the life of Anthony is what Athanasius wrote. So you could come back to this lecture and go to this hyperlink and open up this source if you would like to. There's a second source that I put on here called the Christian History Institute, and you could read it there if you wanted to actually read about Anthony and see for yourself what Athanasius said. Okay, now the thing about Anthony was, over time, and thanks to Athanasius and the Golden Legend, people came to believe that he would protect you or help you to be healed from either leprosy or other skin diseases. And that, of course, was extremely important because skin diseases were rampant in the ancient world, and there were very few ways to heal skin diseases. So he became especially connected with what's called ergotism and erysipelas, and those diseases even got named after him as St. Anthony's fire. The fire was the feeling on the person's skin of being on fire with this awful rash, this awful disease. And there was hope that Anthony would cure you from that. That probably explains one of the reasons that there are many paintings of Anthony. Paintings were commissioned so that his story could be told, so that people could ask him to help them, and so on. But I noticed, and you'll see that in the pictures we're going to look at, a lot of them are especially 15th century, which is actually following upon the bubonic plague. And I think it reflects that the Europe was coming out of this awful experience of the bubonic plague and petrified of more of the same type of pandemic. And so people like Anthony were extremely important. If you don't have medicine, where are you going to get hope? So Anthony kind of represented that. There was also during the Crusades, there was a military and religious order of men called the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. And they were quasi fighters and quasi hospitallers, or we would call them medics. And they made Anthony their patron saint. So that also indicated, the hope that Anthony offered people in terms of healing. Now, here's an interesting fact, though. The Pope at the time gave the Hospitallers the permission to let their pigs run around medieval towns. Now we can say, well, why was that a privilege or a permission? Well, because it meant that their pigs could probably find a lot more scraps than if they had them caged and fed them only themselves. So therefore, their pigs could be bigger, fatter, juicier. And so that was a privilege if you could let your pigs run around. How they knew they were their pigs, I have no idea. Maybe nobody else's pigs could run around, or maybe they had some form of a tattoo or some other kind of mark. In any case, what's interesting then is the pig becomes one of the attributes of pictures of Anthony. And I'll show you one of those later. So remember, pig category is rather broad. It also includes things like boars. So, so if you see a boar or a pig in a picture of a monk, it's likely to be Anthony, because then, of course, the pig becomes the emblem of the Knights Hospitallers. Okay, just to finish up Anthony's story, this is the monastery today where you can go. I haven't been there yet, but I hope to go. So this monastery is on the same place where Anthony's little group of hermits, quasi-hermits, I guess we would call them, monks, lived, and continuously added on over the centuries to this site. So you can see the, well, here at the entrance, actually, it's hard to see it in this picture, and I don't have a better one. Well, this is a little better one. There you can see Anthony over the entryway here, still the inspiration for this monastery. So the cave that people are taken to is up in the hills. Here's the monastery from another angle, and it's up at this level here, if you can see my cursor. So the cave is there. Here's another picture. This is the best picture I have, even though it's black and white from the 1930s. You can see that it's from Dumbarton Oak's Byzantine collection. And yeah, this is the cave. Now keep the idea in mind of what this cave looks like, because in the art, the artists seem to have gotten information, at least if you ask me, of what the cave was like, because they tend to make it elongated, very elongated types of caves in the art. Okay, so back to the monastery just a second, because in contemporary Egypt, this is a very important place. You probably know that the people of Egypt today are predominantly Muslim, but there is a large minority of people who are Coptic, so that would be Orthodox Christians. And those two groups are not always harmonious, because the Coptic Christians feel, what do I want to say, discriminated against. They tend to live mostly in the southern part of the country. They have many have less important work than they really deserve, because they cannot get appointed to positions because they're Christian and so on. But they argue that they are the real Egyptian descendants of the long history way back through the pharaohs. So this monastery and the next one that I'm going to show you in the next story are places where they gather. You can have up to 1,000 Coptic Christians come here on a Sunday to be as a community, to reinforce their identity, and so Anthony and everything he stands for is very much alive in Egypt. Okay, let's move on then. So here again, look at Savoldo now and say, which cave is Anthony's in his picture? Yeah, it's kind of hard to be sure, but here's the one that looks very elongated with a very narrow entrance. So possibly the artist wanted us to think of that as the cave. Down here looks like another cave. Looks like it has a lot of figures from the evil side here. Is that also Anthony? Could that also be Anthony's cave? Yes, because he's running away. So maybe these figures are supposed to indicate evil that was challenging him, bothering him. In any case, in these pictures, you have to look for the cave. Okay, now I have to tell you about another man who's in many of the pictures, and that's Paul of Thebes. So here, going back to this map, go to the southern part of Egypt, and you see the map's in Latin. So you see Thebae, which is ancient Thebes. So there was a man there who was also from there, who was also a hermit, and that's Paul. And he too was a cave dweller. He too was known by a lot of people. And he too was not particularly unusual in the sense that there were a lot of these types of hermits reacting, as I said earlier, to the changes wrought by Constantine in Christianity. Anthony becomes the most famous because Athanasius wrote a story, and the story got copied and sent all over. But Paul predated Anthony a little bit. So Paul, you can see his dates. So he's mid-3rd to 4th century. He too was said to have lived a very, very long life. He's also called Paul the Hermit or Paul the Anchorite. Some people see him as the first hermit. Again, it's hard to know who's exactly first, and it doesn't really matter. He was said to live to be 113 and have been in the desert since he was 16. So he went into the desert earlier than Anthony did. He went into the desert during the last persecution of Christians under Diocletian. So now what's important about him in terms of the story and the attributes is that his cave was near a spring and a palm tree. So he used palm leaves to weave his cloak, and the tree was his source of food. I don't know if it was considered to be a date tree or what, a coconut tree. Not sure what the type of palm trees are there. But when he was 43, a raven, a blackbird, started bringing him a half a loaf of bread daily. So we see that in the paintings. If you see a painting of a monk, looks like a monk, and there's a black bird bringing a loaf of bread flying to him with a half of a loaf, that's Paul. So he stayed at that cave for the rest of his life. And yeah, as I said, the raven then with the bread is one of his attributes. So back to Anthony. Anthony had a dream around 340. And in the dream, he was told that Paul was holier than he was. He knew about Paul, but somehow he was told Paul was holier. So Anthony wanted to meet Paul. Why? Well, you might say Anthony was jealous that Paul was holier. That isn't what the stories of these hermits indicate. They were trying to learn from each other how to be more and more ascetic. So the idea here is that Anthony had already made his life as hard as he could, sleeping on a stone slab, eating very little and only what he could scavenge or what the monks would bring him, having very little water, having very poor clothes, being very cold, on and on and on. So when he hears that Paul is holier than he is, his question is, so what else can I do? What else is hard to do? What else must I do to curb myself to resist evil? Hermits were in the desert not to get away from people. Hermits were there to fight evil. Okay, they were there to be undistracted from anything other than fighting evil, which of course they experienced in all kinds of temptations to leave all these hard things that they were doing. So anyway, Anthony goes to find Paul. And when they met, a raven came, and this time the raven brought a whole loaf of bread. So in pictures that have both Anthony and Paul, you see sometimes the raven with the whole loaf of bread. Now, when Anthony finally found Paul, Paul was already 113. And sure enough, the second time Anthony visited him, he was dead. So, yeah, so Paul died in 340. And when Anthony got there and found Paul dead, he also was a very old man, and he wanted to bury Paul. And 2 lions came along, according to the story. So remember, this is hagiography. Okay, so 2 lions come and help Anthony dig Paul's grave. So the lions are also often in pictures of Anthony and Paul. Now, Paul's story was written in Latin by the famous Saint Jerome. It's called The Life of Saint Paul, the First Hermit. And I didn't track down the sources for it, but if you go to the source of the of Fordham University's medieval source book, I'm sure you can probably get a lead on where to read this too. Okay, here we go with the art of Anthony and Paul. So this is Velázquez. This is pretty much 17th century. It's at the Prado in Madrid. And I'm going to try to zoom into the Prado because they have a really neat way of helping people look at this online. But first, let's just see what we can see as this photo of the masterpiece is. So there you see Anthony's in black and Paul is in white. And they're in front of Paul's cave. There's the raven, and you see the bread is represented as totally round. So that means it's a whole piece of bread, a little bit like our idea of flatbread or pita. But you can see that there's a lot in the background that we have trouble seeing here in a picture of this resolution. And I'm going to show you how the Prado lets us get into this. What this painting is called a continuous narrative or a multi-episode scene. There's lots of these, right? Some art historians point out these are in the days before cartoons, okay? Where instead of a cartoon strip, you can have a multi-episode scene where much of the story is told, or a continuous narrative. So the scenes that are shown here, okay, simultaneously are the following. So we're going to see Anthony asking a centaur how to find Paul. And so this is Anthony's first time to visit Paul. Now, a centaur is a strange creature in Greek mythology that looks like a human on top, but on the bottom has the body and legs of a horse. Okay, so first we're going to see that. Then the scene proceeds where Anthony meets a horned monster with goat's feet. Then the next thing we see is he's knocking on the door to Paul's cave. And then we also see, of course, the raven brings the 2 saints a loaf of bread. And finally, we see the lions helping Anthony dig Paul's grave. So here we go. Let's go to the Prado. Cross your fingers that this works. I don't know. I'm not getting a choice to do the hyperlink here. Well, maybe here it goes. Oh, good, we're in. Okay, so I also need to minimize over here. So what's really neat about this technology is you see over here on the right, you see where you can move.
I see the website still on our screens, at least I do.
Oh, thank you for telling me. I wonder what I need to do.
I think you'll
Okay,
have to go back and choose which screen to share.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can do that. I don't think I can do it. Not sure how I can open this. Okay, I may have to leave it to your follow-up if you'd like to do it. So let's see. Can you see this now? Can you see the hyperlink?
Yes.
Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Mhm.
Anybody tell me, somebody tell me in chat if you can. Please tell me in chat if you can see the hyperlink.
I
Yes.
can, Florence. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So let's keep going then. What we'll do is we'll go backwards. If it will let me. Okay, we'll go back to the picture. Afterwards, once this goes live on YouTube, you can go back to that hyperlink, go to the Prado, and then you can, as you couldn't see, but you will see a rectangular box up in the upper right corner that you can move around, and it will magnify everything. So using this painting, let me show you where those scenes are. So way back here, Anthony meets the centaur, way back here. Then it curves around behind the rock where you can't see it. And then he meets this other strange human goat creature where he's also asking direction. Okay. Then he comes around here and he's over here knocking at Paul's door, Paul's cave entrance. Then he meets Paul, and the raven brings them the bread. And then on his next visit, he has found Paul dead. So he wants to bury Paul. So he's down here burying Paul. And there you see the lions helping him. Helping him dig the grave. Okay. I'm going to continue on now. I just got to make sure you're with me. Let me see here. And okay, Tiffany, can you unmute everybody? First of all, we can take some questions, and I'm going to try to see if I can also see you, which, let's see. Okay, are you unmuted? Oh, good. Okay, I can see you. Can you see me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so let's take a few questions if you'd like for right now. And then I'll go back to sharing.
Florence, this is
Okay,
Becky.
Becky, hi.
Hi, can you show that link one more time about the museum? If you can show that one more time, that would be great.
Okay, I will go back to that after these questions. Sure, I'll be glad to. And then you'll be able to get it on YouTube version. And Tiffany, will this also be on Facebook version?
Yes, it will.
Yeah, so you can get it on the Facebook version or the YouTube version.
Great.
You can also go into the Prado, just go into the Prado's website and put in St. Paul and St. Anthony. And you'll have a lot of fun with that viewer because of the magnification. I did not, when I first started studying that painting, I did not see 5 scenes in it because the magnification of the painting was not that great. Any other questions or comments?
I just had a comment. This is Dee Dee Hollowell. Hi, everybody. I was in the gallery when it was before it was rearranged so that they're switched. And I can remember, and I just mentioned it for the sake of our wonderful guards. They hang around there all day long, poor souls, and watch everybody come through, And obviously, one of the guards had heard the docents keep saying he's running away or running towards. Anyway, the choice is between hell and the monastery kind of choice. And they said, why do they say he's running? He's pivoting. You can see he's sitting and he's turned in his prayer towards what would be, I agree with you, Florence, that would be the monastery that commissioned it. That sounds, it looks very familiar, frankly. And so, I just, for the sake of the guards, let's say pivot and not run. They're so tired of hearing that he's running. Okay.
Oh,
I think that's funny.
Maybe it is a pivot, whatever.
Yeah,
He's
doing
either
it.
way, he's changing position, huh? Okay, any other comments? Okay, someone suggested in chat the good idea that I put the hyperlink in chat. I will try to do that, okay? I'll try to do that at the end. Okay, so let's go back then, because there's so much more to look at here. Okay, so, well, here's another painting then of this meeting between Anthony and Paul. Here, this is another continuous narrative, a little more simple than the previous one. But here you see Anthony on his way, coming around the mountain here, and meeting the centaur here. And then finally getting to Paul at Paul's cave. So a little simpler, but basically a similar idea. Now this artist, Stephen John Stefano di Giovanni, is called it should be Il Sassetto with an A on the end, or Sassetto. No, it's right. Il Sassetto, or else we just call him Sassetto. Anyway, this one at the National Gallery is similar. So this one, he had 3 episodes, and yeah, where Anthony meets the centaur and so on. Okay, now Paul also inspired a monastic setting, and this is the monastery of St. Paul today, which you can see has grown enormously over the centuries. And it again is a very significant place today for Coptic Orthodox Christians of Egypt. And this monastery claims that it has the actual grave of Paul. It's also called the Monastery of the Tigers. And the reason is because of the tigers in the narrative helping to dig Paul's grave. So, yeah, the cave church, it has 3 churches on the spot, but the cave church is dug down into what was an area of Anthony's grave, Paul's grave. So it's 3 meters below the current level of the level ground around it. By that, I mean the ground, the monastery is high up, but once you get high up there, it's 3 meters below that level ground. Yeah, so it's the tradition is that the oldest part of the church is in the hollowed out cave where Anthony lived and in the area where he's buried. Okay, now here's another link that you might want to pick up on too. I don't have time to include this, but there's a documentary. I say it's rather recent. I think it was 2006. So 2 younger Danish men became very interested in these hermits in their own life journey, I guess you could say, in their own kind of spiritual search. And they decided to go find these hermits today. So in their documentary, you can get some really good footage of this type of a place. And you can also see how the monastery functions in relation to the more permanent hermits, because they kind of protect them. They don't tell people exactly where their cave is, and they don't tell people when they're going to take food to them and so on, until maybe they, after a while, when they trust you that you're not going to interrupt them too much. But this is pretty interesting. I recommend it if you feel interested in more about this. Okay, now moving on here, another painting by Sassetto, this one in Siena, is Anthony beaten by the devils. And here you see representing what's very much a part of Anthony's story. And that is because he's alone, he's in the dark, he's cold, he's hungry, he's perhaps hallucinating. He has these awful experiences of devils constantly attacking him and telling him, you know, tempting him to do all kinds of things. So this becomes a very big motif, you could say, in paintings about him. And this one used to be attributed to Sassetto. Now there's some discussion of whether or not he really did it, whether it maybe is a studio work by numerous artists in training, perhaps. Anyway, it's not really a continuous narrative as far as I can find out. But what is interesting is it is known that there was originally a pot of gold right over here. So it's showing Anthony being tempted by this pot of gold. And somebody, for some reason, has removed it. Now that's an intriguing question, because why? Because it really takes away the action in the picture, you could say. Because the action is Anthony being tempted to just give up, be rich, go back to a regular life. And why someone removed it, I'm not sure art historians have a real answer for that. Okay, that one is in a series of 8 panels that were an altarpiece. And yeah, I think I've already made the points. Okay, finally we come to Michelangelo. And Michelangelo also painted the torment of Anthony, but under unusual or interesting circumstances. So he does this the end of the 15th century. And okay, starting in the lower left, you see the representation of his cave. So he's taken out of his cave, he's levitated out of it. And that's part of his story, that he levitated, that he was literally flown around the desert by angels or by demons. And here you see these terribly scary creatures. Notice that some are fish, okay? Huge fish here. Another one, I believe, over here. But the story of this is interesting because, first of all, Michelangelo, well, let me tell you this first. This could depict an episode in Athanasius' Life of Anthony, chapter 65. So yeah, Anthony has this vision of himself floating through the air with strange beings keeping him from going back to his own sanity, I guess. Some people think it also could show a 9th chapter where he's attacked by the devil in the form of animals. In any case, he's levitated, and he's probably literally levitated, lightheaded because of so much fasting. He also, according to the stories, was normally flown around by angels. But here's the really interesting part. Michelangelo was given this, or shown this etching by Schongauer that had been done a couple decades earlier, which is The Temptation of Anthony, and the Metropolitan has this in New York. So Michelangelo was just a young boy. He was just a teenager, and he was told to paint on the basis of the etching, paint the scene. So what's very interesting, I put these two together so we can try to compare them. If you ask me, Michelangelo has brought the scene to life in a much more vivid way, of course. But also, he was rather scientific in the sense that his biographer, Condivi, said that he actually went to the fish market to study fish scales so that he got these right, and so on. Now, I'm saying Michelangelo did it. Let me also point out first, notice that Michelangelo puts the caves in here more prominently. Schongauer has it here. Can't be sure which is what's supposed to be Anthony's cave in Schongauer, but in Michelangelo, we get this idea again of this elongated entrance. Also, the river here, perhaps it's supposed to represent the Nile. Although the cave was on the west side of the mountains. So, but actually those who analyze this picture say it's more reminiscent of Florence and the Arno River in Florence. Okay, so there is some discussion of whether Michelangelo really did this. If he did it, it would be one of his first, if not his very first. He might have been 12 or 13 when he mostly identifies himself as a sculptor. Nevertheless, it's pointed out, but he started out in the studio of Ghirlandaio. So Ghirlandaio could have, or his assistants could have told Michelangelo, you need to try to do this. So Condivi, his biographer, he said that Michelangelo's debut piece was a repainted replica of Schongauer's etching. So that seems to support it, that it is a Michelangelo. And Athanasius mentions this event, that Anthony had a revelation in which he floated into the sky and was attacked by demons, but he endured. So we finish with this comparison. I'm kind of running out of time here. I think I already said all this. I just close with Pisanello. This is a 15th century painting. Again, you see Anthony on the left, and now this is St. George on the right, looking very dapper in his 15th century outfit. This painting is very unusual because it's got a Madonna and Child at the top, which doesn't seem to relate very much to what is at the bottom. That's a whole question that we could pursue, but what I'd like to pursue very quickly and end with is, you see St. George is very well dressed. He's a knight, he's rich, and you see the dragon at his feet. Now you got to look really closely, but here's the attribute of an attribute of Anthony. There's the pig. It's a boar. B-O-A-R. It's a boar, but you see the attribute in this painting. One of the attributes of George is always a dragon, with the story of how he slayed the dragon and so on. Okay, you look at the Hermit as opposed to the very socially involved St. George. You look at the man dressed in poor, raggedy type clothing, and St. George dressed like a rich knight. And I think you're left with a big question, and that is, as I put it here at the end, did this painting suggest that St. George's way of living Christianity was as valid as Anthony's? In other words, juxtaposition of two saints, two very different ways of living. Maybe, maybe this representation of St. George is in dialogue with Anthony's story, in the sense that those knights that were fighting in the name of Christianity, were they also living a valid Christian way of living? So we can see almost the argument jumping out of this painting. I think I have to stop here because it was all inspired by this painting. When you're at the Timken, please enjoy this painting. And I would love to have some discussion now. So let's see if I can open it up to see you again. Let's see, I'll stop the share here. Okay, so who wants to jump in here? First of all, Tiffany, can you put everybody on mute? Thank you for zooming in. Yes, Joan. I can't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oftentimes when I am at that painting, I will bring out the little diagram of Hieronymus Bosch and use that comparison for a lot of those little creatures. Those little devilish creatures are so similar.
Yes.
I find a lot of the people can get up close rather than getting so close to the actual painting. They can see a lot of the similar paintings in Hieronymus's.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, yeah. And often Savoldo's, the right side of Savoldo's painting is said to be under the influence of Bosch. Although I believe there's a lot of question over whether he ever would have actually seen Bosch. But yeah, that's always brought up, I think.
Also,
Yes.
about the hogs running around, wasn't that a time when you said that they were having a lot of disease? I'm just
Yeah.
thinking of those hogs running around, they're eating all the trash that was really kind of promoting all the illness at the time. So the other thing was they were probably cleaning things up and maybe helping people stay more healthy. Just my idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously it was an advantage to let your pig run around since it was granted to them as a privilege. So yeah, the science behind it, or the social, what I want to say, triumph behind getting that privilege, is a whole thing we could speculate about for a long time, I'm sure. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you all for jumping in and zooming in today. It's been a pleasure. And I will, let's see, if I put the links in the chat, well, that won't last, though, will it, Tiffany? I think you'll have to get to, the best way to get to the links will be either on Facebook or on YouTube once the presentation is released to that. So thank you all. I'll sign off.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you, Florence, for that lecture.
Bye-bye.
And then, yeah, thank you all for joining us. Our next talk, just so you know, will be on the 23rd of February, and it will be at 11 a.m. again. And it's titled The High Renaissance in Italy, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and Others. So that's, going to be a pretty cool talk. Yeah, thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.